Welcome to my Age of Wonders 4 early game guide, where I'll share with you some tips and tricks on how to set up a game properly for success in terms of gameplay, the first few turns, and the decisions that you'll be making that will determine whether you rise to glory or flail in defeat. If you wouldn't mind leaving a like on this video, that would be grand. Now let's jump straight in. There are a load of different powerful traits here, but when we're talking about specifically the early game or expansion and building a better empire, there are a couple of ones I'd like to highlight. Silver-tongued could be useful if you'd like to grab an extra scout. That is entirely an option for you. Likewise, the vision range out of Shadow Walkers. However, I think there's more power to be had here in terms of building an empire and establishing cities. For example, Wonder Architects could provide us with a free wonder and 20% production on our cities. Of course, there's some more focused ones as well. Adept Settlers, you can't go wrong. I'll be taking this one for this video. Gives us an extra city cap, makes our new cities cheaper, and start with extra population and territories. We could also look to something like Prolific Swarmers, which will make our cities consume less food over time, ultimately allowing them to grow faster. Or of course we could grab just a generally always powerful effect, like Mana Addicts, to get lifesteal attunement, Mana Addicted I should say, on our units. Or alternatively Fabled Hunters, if you'd like to go out and hunt a lot of infestations in the early game. Welcome everybody to the very first turn of the game, which of course by now you'll likely be very familiar with. You'll get an overview of who you're playing, your Tome of Magic, all that kind of thing. There are, however, some very important decisions that need to be made on turn one, and I've got some tips and tricks around them too, so hopefully you can make them right. First and foremost, of course, you'll need to choose a research. That'll be down to the tome that you've selected. If you want to move through this tome quicker, pay attention to the research cycles down the bottom left, and try and research things that are as cheap as possible, that take the fewest number of turns. Doing that will get you through the research cycle and ultimately the tome faster. Otherwise, try and find generally good benefits, like new units to unlock or healing spells. When it comes to your units, you'll of course likely start with an army of 5 or 6 and 1 scout. The scout should be sent along roads as much as possible, and also sent in and around nearby alongside your other army to pick up these goodies that are just sitting around not at all guarded. We can grab extra food and stuff like this early on. We'll be able to grow our city up and grab some extra populations. So I'm going to make that my first turn priority, just to whip out, grab the food, and ultimately probably grow the city. City growth is handled over here on the left-hand side, and it's a pretty basic equation. The number of population you already have will determine whether your city needs more food, right? So a city with more pops needs to eat more. And then the other thing is how much food you're getting per turn. That will determine how quickly you'll grow. At the moment, we need 133 food, and we'll get there in 2 turns. However, of course, I have some expansion to do already, partly because we started with an extra territory, and as we pick up food, etc., we'll be able to grow even further still. If you're unfamiliar with the expansion, it's pretty straightforward. We reach out, build improvements, and grab territories. I only have a couple of quick tips here. First and foremost, you want to zoom out and just check that there isn't anyone else nearby. This may not be the case in the very beginning of the game, but as you expand out further and wider, it will become much more important. And then the second thing is to have a look at the resources. And honestly, zooming out like this can be one of the best ways to see them on this tactical map. You can see here I have a gold vein next door, which will give me 10 gold when I annex the tile. 10 food from some sheepy pastures around the place, treasure chest, and a couple of other rewards, as well as an iron deposit. So I know which way roughly I want to expand. It's probably out towards these 2 resources, or down along the coastline, maybe up to these ones. Now that I can jump back into the city, I get to determine what I want to build. And of course, there are really a few things that you need to focus on right at the start of the game, and it's to ensure that you get these boosted buildings unlocked, right? If you've watched my beginner's guide, which takes you from the beginning of the game right the way through to victory, then you'll be a little bit familiar with this. But in this video, where we're a bit more focused around early game tips and expansion, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, a few extra tips and tricks. And here, though, the basic principle is that we want to make sure that we get a farm, a quarry, and a forester. And as I look through the different buildings and try and figure out which ones I want to build first, generally it's a good idea to build your special cultural building. In this case, it's clergy commons for me, the library for knowledge, and food for growth. Don't get me wrong, production and draft for buildings and units is also very important. But for me, at the very start, I'm focused on getting food online so we can grow and pick up more tiles faster, and my knowledge, because I want to outpace my enemies in terms of the units that I'm unlocking. Now that I know that I want a farm, a quarry, or a forester, and probably for a lot of my goals, I'm actually looking at the forester for the most part. Indeed, my storehouse and my library both require it. So I look for a territory that can build a forester. In this case, it's just these two. That's not great. That is not great. Why? Because I'm not improving one of the ones that has a special resource on it. Here, I could build a mine and get 15 gold, plus 10 from the gold vein. Or, of course, as we've discussed before, I could also just build a farm. It doesn't matter what I build, I'll always get the gold vein so long as it's cleared of enemies. So I should focus on what will boost my buildings first. I know that I need foresters, but also farms. So in this case, I'm actually going to choose to build a farm on one of these territories. One of these territories that's going to make me a little bit more value early on. In this case, I'm choosing between quarry, so production, and gold. I'm already making 100 gold per turn, basically. So at the moment, while we don't have a lot of buildings, I'm going to build a farm on this iron deposit tile. That will bring, of course, a little bit of extra food into the city. We're now at 50, so we'll grow slightly faster, although not enough to tip it over an extra turn. But also, of course, it's given us a little bit of extra production. So now the boosted buildings that I'll have from building my farm, which granted is the vendor and the workshop, not the two that I wanted to start with, but take a look at the value difference here now. 3 turns and 42 gold versus 5 turns and 60 gold. And these are the kinds of decisions that you'll be making early on. For me, in this case, I'm going to queue up a workshop, which will give me extra production, so I'll be able to build my cities faster. I have enough money that I'm going to hurry the production immediately, and I would encourage you to do the same unless you're recruiting armies, because of course there's a trade-off at the start of the game. Do I want to finish my buildings, or do I want to recruit faster? In this case, I'm going to pump that workshop out immediately, and then I'm going to get the vendor queued up and ready to go while we wait to expand to one more tile so we can get the forester down and start to boost these buildings too. In terms of training your units at the start of the game, it can be sometimes a good idea to pick up a second scout. This will depend largely, of course, on the size of the map that you're playing on, how many enemies you're playing against, and how important scouting is for you and your culture and your society traits. It's not a bad idea to pick up an additional scout. I wouldn't go any further than that, though, because a lot of scouting can be done with regular armies, and of course it's very useful if you're scouting with a regular army to have them show up, because then they might be able to take down infestations, pick up loot, clear natural ancient wonders, and all sorts of other things like that. But it is a good idea to start training a couple of early units, hover over them, check how much damage they do, any abilities they have, and make sure that you have a broadly diverse army, a couple of polearm units, and a couple of ranged units, for example. The turns after turn 1, right, those sort of early game, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, often play out in a very similar way, but I've got a few quick tips that I'd like to share with you here. Firstly, when we click on a tile, regardless of who owns it, we can see whether there's a claim over it. In this case, it's my claim, which is great. Of course, it's right next to me. That means there's unlikely to be an enemy just next door. We can also see the kinds of improvements that we'll be able to build on it. So if I'm looking for somewhere where I want to build, say, foresters, for example, then obviously these pastures are not the right place. The other thing to note is if there are any immediate enemies blocking rewards around our city, we should clear them out before we move on any further. For example, here you can see an NPC army is standing on top of my beautiful sheep right here. This is not great. I might want to move to this tile sometime soon. You know, it's a great food tile. So we're going to move over here, pick up some early experience, and clear them out. If you're unfamiliar with Age of Wonders 4's combat, its auto combat tends to be pretty good, although you may take losses from time to time, particularly if you don't have any healing abilities early on in the game. You may wish to retry, re-roll, and fight it manually to find success and protect your units. As we move across the map, of course, you'll also know that we'll start to pick up different kinds of items, from clearing those infestations, clearing NPC armies. It's almost always a good idea to jump into your hero screen, inspect them, and equip as much stuff as you possibly can, even if it doesn't look like quite a great fit, right? Like here's Valerie Brewer, the drunken humanoid, with her bow. Maybe she doesn't want a wand. No, she absolutely does, because the things on this side are essentially hero abilities or extra benefits. It doesn't take up my weapon slot, but it does allow me, on a cooldown of 1 turn, to cast this support ability, Wand of Inversion, in this case removing negative status effect from a target ally and granting a positive effect to them for each -1 removed. All of these little benefits that you can stack on your hero in the early game will be very powerful. You should make sure that you're fighting with them as much as you can to rank up their hero skills as well. Lucky news for me, everybody. Because I expanded to this tile, I can now expand one further. Cities do have a hard-coded limit on how many tiles they can expand. I believe it starts at around 2 or 3, but you can get it to go out pretty far, like around sort of 7 tiles, if you're playing a ridiculous one city thing. But because we've unlocked this one, we've gained access to the ones adjacent, and here, my friends, we have actually a good forester. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not just a random forest tile with nothing extra on it, providing me with a measly 2 food and 3 production. This one does have a resource. It looks to me like it's a food resource, and as you can see, there are some sheep hiding underneath this floral stinger. So I'll clear that out and expand to that tile. A quick note, I can expand to the tile first, so I'm going to do that immediately. They won't pillage it because they're not a red army. It's only the red NPC armies, or of course someone that you're at war with, that will choose to fight you without being provoked. Choose to pillage your territories without being provoked. In this case, they won't do that, and so I'm safe to pick this up, and I'll get the base yield from it, but I won't get the extra yield from the sheep until I clear them out. So obviously, that's going to be our next move. The scout is, of course, by itself unable to really clear out a lot of these relatively weak, granted, NPC armies protecting stuff. So my advice to you with the scout would be to just send them out far and wide. Their main objective will be to achieve this, meeting your closest city-state. And if you haven't started at war with them, which you probably haven't, if you have, I'm sorry about that, you'll have to pay them off, fight them, or move on, you should absolutely, of course, give them your Whispering Stone. This will move you through the pacts, like the Pact of Cooperation, and ultimately towards vassalization. And once you've got them there, they'll be on your side throughout future conflicts, they'll contribute all sorts of yield to your empire, you'll be able to trade with them. It's a really good idea, and the scout's primary purpose at the start of the game should be to track down the closest city-state to you and get them on side. If they don't like you, destroy them. If they don't mind you, they're neutral or they like you, then I suggest you build up your relationship, and ultimately, of course, you could take them over if you wish. They tend to provide a nice, well-established city. They almost always have these magical materials, which are like resource nodes, like this gold vein, but of course, even stronger because they're one-off. They provide global effects too. It's a great way to pick up a developed city close to your capital so that you can build for future victory conditions as well. The scout or scouts, of course, have other kind of goals that they're working towards at the start as well. They're trying to plot out where everyone is, including your closest city-state ally. I'd argue that's actually probably the most important find beyond the enemies. But also, of course, they're looking for various things, like entrances to the underground, like these infestations, which will spawn out nasty enemies and give us a sweet reward if we can clear it, and also any other oddities around the map. If you find a watchtower, for example, stepping on it will wham bam thank you ma'am, give you a whole load of vision around the area. Very useful indeed. Okay, so now we're coming up to around turn 5. This is sort of a turning point for me, where I want to make sure that I've cleared out most of the stuff around my starting capital, so that I can start to send my hero, because of course, heroes, rulers, they're the only units that can move out and actually place new cities. So I need to make sure that I have a party with my ruler at the front, ready to move out and place down some cities. Generally, of course, it's a good idea to place them relatively close to the capital, so we'll scout out some future opportunity for that. But of course, first and foremost, before I do that, and before my hero gets very, very busy indeed, I need to make sure that I clear out anything around my base, providing extra training support where needed so that we have the power to clear out maybe some slightly stronger enemies. At this point in the early game with your city development, you should, like I have here, have some pretty good boosts online. You should have got your production potentially up a little bit. And so most of the basic buildings, like the storehouse and library, should at this point be very cheap. And so we'll start to move through to the second tier of building, like the more advanced storehouse, the granary, like the more advanced library, the arcane institute. There's about 4 tiers of these buildings, and of course, as we move through, each one will have new requirements. The granary wants 2 foresters now instead of 1. So I'll have to factor that in as we develop. And another great way to develop just before we start saving up for our cities, or into investing in this, the development tree, we could use a little bit of Imperium to boost our populations. In this case, boosting it's only going to give me 9 food, so I might wait until next turn and see how much it costs. But using the attract population is a really powerful effect to reach out and grab more valuable tiles early. Again, of course, we're going to apply a lot of that early mindset. We're going to look for areas that have something special about them, like sheep. any tile that can give us a little bit of extra resource is a winning tile for me. In this case, now that we've moved through to the next turn, I can see it's going to cost me about a turn's worth of Imperium to attract population. I would suggest you don't go overboard with this, particularly as you're getting ready to expand. But I'm going to do it once quite handily. So now I'll be able to pick up one tile. In this case, I'm going to choose a quarry, because as you can see, I really don't have a lot of space to build quarries here. There's in fact only this one tile where there's gold at the moment that I can build a quarry on. So that for me is a must. We're going to need at least one quarry to start getting boosts. Now I can see I have one farm, one quarry, and one forester down the bottom left here. So I'm probably just going to try and go through and get a second one for each of those. Again, prioritizing the best looking tiles. Here I see one with some sheep. Om nom nom. We'll consume that up. That'll help us grow loads of food. Our growth rate's looking fairly decent. And we've got a 5-pop city. As you start to move through, you'll also receive some extra benefits through the game's development tree, which of course you can access at any time by clicking Empire Development. In terms of early game strategies and expansion, there are a few things that I would recommend to you here. First and foremost, obviously, newly founded or absorbed cities gaining +1 population is really great. Fruitful integration is fantastic. Likewise, next door, farms providing 5 extra food. Brilliant stuff. A few other useful ones you'll generally find in the, go figure, general tree. For example, here you can get an extra whispering stone, allowing you to attract an additional city-state ally, very useful. You'll of course want general seafaring, basic seafaring if you want to make it across the ocean, or perhaps excavation to dig out some earthen terrain. And you really can't go wrong with expanded governance, increasing your city camp by 1, and you can claim this one multiple times. This is a repeatable general right. It will become more expensive every time, of course, the second time, for example, costing 500 Imperium, but this is a great pickup nonetheless. If you're focusing on city-states, you'll of course maybe want to look into order, for example. Destroying infestations can get you a whole load of relations with free cities. You can also, of course, pick up extra whispering stones here and gain extra benefits out of your vassals. A very nice and focused one. If you'd prefer to go out and fight, I could recommend a couple of pickups in the early chaos tree here, saving you unit upkeep, rewarding you extra for infestations, among other things, like making you a bit of cash money. Thanks to our early game research and unlocking the Houndmaster unit early on, I've now got this in my arsenal. Very early game. It's a great idea to get an extra unit, especially if they're powerful. You could choose to summon it in or train it, but you should look for something that's a tier above and that has some interesting effects. In this case, Unleash the Hounds allows me to summon a Warhound into the early game, an extra unit inside of my fight. Not bad. Around turn 10, I might look to my scouts and decide that actually it's time for me to focus a little bit more on empire development. I've met a couple of nearby people, perhaps, so I could always choose to move down here and put them on auto explore, and that'll make sure that the AI just runs them around and I can check in on them every few turns. They'll do a great job at picking up little goodies around the map that aren't being guarded, as well as, of course, plotting out things like the underground, which I haven't looked at yet in this game. We have certainly been growing, and it's around that sort of just after turn 10 period where you want to start to take stock, as I've mentioned, and send the hero out to find a new place to place a city. Now, this is actually a really great example because it's quite a difficult example. So here you can see I have my main city, and I've expanded out to the right to grab some extra tiles and push up against this infestation, which actually is not an infestation, it's an enemy city-state. And they've got some really nice tiles. For whatever reason, when I met these guys, they're quite evil, perhaps quite different to me, they just declared war straight away. I could, of course, choose to make peace for 182 bucks and call it a day. The other option would be to send the armies down there and destroy it, because what I'm looking for is a third city slot, at least a third city slot. I have my capital, and I'm assuming that Berkshire will be mine one way or another. We're making our way towards a pact. They'll end up being a vassal. I may choose to just take them over altogether. So now I have a final factor in here where we have an enemy. Old mole man over here looking really, really proud of himself has unfortunately settled very close to our capital. So I basically have, the way I see it, 3 options. Option number 1 is to place down a city near-ish to this one, probably up in this top right-hand corner. Although, without much land there, I could also choose to nestle it up here next to the mountains and get kind of a triangle of cities going like this, where this one chooses to expand up to the right, Berkshire continues to expand up that way, And of course, my capital continues to grow down here. It's a good idea generally to try and triangulate your cities or keep them close together for your victory conditions later in the game and for easier defense. The other option, of course, would be to go to war and capture a third city. I could take flowing fields pretty easily, or if I really felt ballsy, I could jump into a fight with this guy and take that city down. When it comes to choosing your tomes of magic, of course, I can't lean in ultimately to the strategy that you'll be playing, but I can provide a few early game tips and tricks on what ones might be sort of universally slightly better than the rest. Generally, you want to look at the Tome of Beasts, or potentially the Tome of Roots. Roots gives you some wonderful unit upgrades, Vine Prison, which spawns in 5 rather crappy Vine units, but they're great distractions. You also unlock a unit you can summon in with magic. Likewise, inside of Beasts, wonderful synergy, new units to unlock, the ability to summon units onto the world map, very powerful early on. Alternatively, of course, you might look to try and go for a buff, a heal kind of build. There's certainly some strength in doing that and pulling together a load of different spells and enchantments that can kind of make you better in the fight. Deal extra base damage, heal yourself, condemn the enemy. So there are plenty of good options. Tome of Zeal, Fanatical Workforce is also a great way to cast spells on your cities if you're not so interested in the combat side of things. Your hero will be very busy early on though, because of course, as we've mentioned earlier, there are other things you might want to do, like for example, taking down this great bird nest. Although that is a silver infestation, we could certainly take it. In this case, I'm going to look at these ruins, a bronze ancient wonder, the lowest rank, a very powerful tile if I can capture it, right? The territory provides knowledge and Imperium, as well as, for example, a unit deploy point. It'll add additional units to my Rally of Lieges mechanic, so I can potentially recruit some more powerful units early on. These things, these wonders in Age of Wonders, go figure, are incredibly important. What we're going to do here, in this case, is send in an army. Much like founding a city, of course, we need a hero to be able to do it. And generally, there's an option to strike and attack, buff yourself or buff your units in some way, or flee. So if the enemy army looks too strong, just flee. Generally, it's a good idea to choose the middle option if you can. In this case, growth is blocked for 3 turns, but we can clear the ruins without a fight. Or do I want to fight? In this case, it's a close call. You could take it either way. I'm going to clear it without the fight because that is an easy dub. We'll use the reward, which was 208 mana, as well as 209 gold, to make good. Sure, we're not growing for 3 turns, but you know what? We're going to queue you up a stonemason. How about that? And of course, I'll keep training armies. Once you've cleared an ancient wonder, you'll notice its border sort of goes a little bit dotty, lined like this. That means you're not yet getting the rewards because it's not within your city. So what I could choose to do is grow and expand and grab that tile, which is a perfectly viable option. Another thing you could do though, if it's further away from your city or you can't expand that far, is simply go like this. Grab your hero army, move 1 tile next door, and build an outpost. And in 2 turns, I'll have an outpost built here, and it will be able to absorb this tile and immediately bring in the Imperium and knowledge that it's providing into the Empire. Once an outpost is established, of course, we have a few different options. This one is ugly close to my starting city, but it's actually not the end of the world because in this build I have additional city cap to work with. So it's not too bad. I could, of course, also just leave it as an outpost. It's only really there to claim the wonder at this point, though there is plenty of room to expand. Of course, you'll notice it costs Imperium, and in this case, it's only going to take me 1 turn to found a city. Other options, which are decent, I could take a work camp. If I didn't want to turn this into a city, this is the option I would choose. This allows me to keep it as an outpost, but claim 1 adjacent tile. I would, of course, claim this one, the ruins, and then I would have it connected to my empire. So if you don't want to make a city, that's a perfectly fine way to do it. In this case, I think the city is the right choice. We're behind a little bit where we should be in terms of our city development, and we have the extra city cap to play with. So that would be my advice to you. Pay attention to your city cap. Can you afford to support an extra city? If so, great. Make it a city. If not, feel free to leave it as an outpost. There's a very small running cost to having outposts online, and potentially huge reward depending on what you're connecting with them. Alright, my city is online. I've used a little bit of Imperium to attract some additional population. You can see I've grabbed the ruins, I've grabbed a nice harbor tile which has a bit of food. Of course, we're going to need tiles to get our boosted buildings online, so let's grab a forest up there as well. Try and snake some land tiles this way so that these 2 cities share a nice long border. That'll be important for defending certain city structures in future. And of course, as you increase the number of cities you have, you also increase your hero cap. Hero cap is tied to the number of cities you have, not your city cap overall. In this case, of course, I have an extra slot, so it's not going to cost me extra gold to recruit an additional hero, like it would if I went over the city cap. As I move toward and into turn 20, the early game starts to fall away, right? You can see now I've got a pretty large city, I've got multiple cities online. We're getting near to the point where we can start to vassalize our city-state, and unfortunately I have some border tensions, including, of course, this very angry city-state down to the south that's fighting me, and an enemy that is rapidly encroaching in on my land. The good news is our expansion plan has largely paid off. We've got a second city online, a third by means of our vassal, and we're looking to move out and place down a couple of extra outposts now that I've got an extra hero. Getting the extra hero online really unlocks your ability, right, to move out, to place down outposts, right? I could smack one down right here next to Berkshire, and it might not actually be a terrible idea considering it could pick up a watchtower, an underground passage, and some very valuable resources over here soon. In fact, I think I might just do that right now. Important to note, of course, as well, as I'm moving through, I'm picking up a few extra things to help me expand, like seafaring, which I had to get. If you have some points inside of militarism, outposts costing 50% less gold out of military engineering can also be nice. But by and large, I think you can see that I'm starting to build a pretty cohesive structure and strategy for how to set up a solid early game experience. And from here, I could actually almost choose any victory condition I like. When it comes to expanding out, once things start to get a little bit more difficult like this, you want to make sure that your cities share a border in case you get any border-related benefits moving forward, as well as, of course, defense and victory. And you'll also want to make sure that you expand smart. So if I take this tile, which is right next door to old the Hans Molman over here, it's going to make him a little bit angry. Potentially there'll be grievances, right, building near me. So it will give potentially some justification for war. However, it's important to note that once the tile's gone, the tile's gone. So in this case, I'm going to expand somewhat aggressively into this occupied tile, grab the third quarry that I need to get 3 of each, and make sure that I pick up what land is mine. Of course, you could also choose to do this like we've done up here by placing down outposts. These get, of course, particularly cheap. Once we move through, start to pick up a few extra benefits. In this case, the outposts that's forming here only cost me a measly 25 gold, right? I mean, that is nothing. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Outpost online, and we're ready to hook up to any other extra resources that we might want. Or, of course, turn it into, you guessed it, yet another city, everybody. And bam, we've cleared the infestation nearby. Of course, another target from early on in the early game. We should be looking towards infestations to grant nice benefits like this Book of Siegecraft. That's a nice pickup. Potentially extra units and yields for our cities, as well as, of course, those ancient wonders and finding our city-states. Those are our key objectives for clearing out and securing the territory nearby. Of course, I'll need to keep doing that in and around here, maybe make the most of the spider's movement to trigger this fight this turn as well. And we can get the city looking in a really good place. And as you begin to move through to around turn 20 to 30, you'll start to be able to grab extra tile improvements too, like the one we got on the Ancient Wonder. I thought it would be just important to note that there are a couple of other extra types, right? Research posts for knowledge and conduits for mana. In this case, we'll also get a nice benefit from these haste berries once we clear out these fairies that are occupying the tile. It is a good idea to pick some of these up, though make sure you grab your building boosting things first. That's generally a good idea. Maybe some exceptions could, of course, be made for a little bit of knowledge, research posts, wonders, that kind of thing. And finally, towards the end of the video, I want to talk about early game conflict. It's, of course, something we've dealt with already as we've moved across this land and started to found our triangulation of cities, picked up our city-states, you know, all that kind of stuff. But also there's plenty of opportunity at the start of the game to fight. If your city-state doesn't like you, I would really encourage you to siege them down. Take a look at this. Turn 23, here I am. I've got my main hero's army, quite strong at this point. You know, we've got a bit of extra experience, but also we are kind of just basic tier 1 units with a couple of summoned units around the edges. And this siege is really not all that difficult against particularly a free city. I could win it already with 695 strength against their 394. And of course, if I slap in a couple of extra siege projects, maybe just the one even, it should put us in an even better place, not only to destroy an enemy, but also to grab an additional city. And welcome to turn 30, folks. This is where I'm going to round out this video and sort of summarize where we got to and how we got here. So we've ended up founding 3 cities. Florin is a little bit squished, granted. The other 2 have some good reach and scope while bumping up against the enemy. We've successfully defeated flowing fields, thus forcing them to bend the knee to us, though they could be difficult moving forward. Our relationship is, to be fair, a little bit strained. And then, of course, we have the city-state that we met right at the start, Berkshire, which now, thanks to our Whispering Stone and our Flourishing Allegiance, can be integrated. I can turn this into a city of my own. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It's done. Of course, now I can pick up an extra hero because we have more and more cities. And of course, I can set its production priorities, what kind of units, etc. it wants to build, and where it wants to expand. So we now have 4 successful cities, a new city-state that we're building up to be a vassal, and of course, I'm now looking to the future, towards my enemies. We've cleared out our immediate area, picked up all of our rewards, and now I'm reaching out for victory, probably, with, to be fair, a really solid foundation here. 4 reasonable cities and a city-state ally next door, with a little bit of room still, probably, actually, to expand. I think an outpost, at least, near this guardian tree would be a good idea, potentially as well, also, some sort of outpost up this way, probably, actually, next door to this crawler's nest and underground passage. Still plenty of places to grow and expand. And thank you so much for joining me today for this early game tips and expansion guide. I'll see you all next time.